and hormonal imbalances. The majority of her clients are people who are so sensitive that they have not been able to tolerate the typical treatment approaches used with most LLMD/LLNDs and other functional medicine practitioners. Billy offers a unique and personalized approach to reducing mast cell activation syndrome and treating these long-term illnesses in a way that is better tolerated and more effective in the long run. Her passion for helping others using this personalized approach comes from privately battling decades of her own health problems, including MCAS, chronic Lyme disease, and mold illness. After being treated by several different LLMDs and LLNDs and a wide range of other modalities, she just kept getting worse and became less and less tolerant to the recommended treatments and more reactive to the environment. She became passionate about researching and getting extra training and education in the area of MCAS and histamine intolerance to understand what the effective and tolerated treatment approaches were that could be used for patients who have mast cell activation syndrome as part of their chronic illness. She used this knowledge to get her own MCAS under control and make real progress with her root cause issues like mold, Lyme, and gut infections. And now her focus is to share that knowledge with others who find themselves in the same position. And just for a reminder for all of you, if you have any problems getting through or anything with the video, feel free to text Jody at 720-280-2341. And if anybody has any questions, to please put them in chat. We will have a discussion with Billy to let her speak, and then we'll have a Q&A when she's finished. Thank you, and I'll hand it over to Billy.
Thanks, Joanne. That was a long bio. I should have given you even a shorter one. It sounded really long to me. Well, thanks so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, you guys.
Oh.
So let's see if we're getting that. All right. Are you getting my presentation now?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. Let me move this stuff out of the way here. Hold on just a second. Okay. Okie dokie. Sorry, you guys, got to move all these toolbars out of the way so that they're not in my view. There we go. Okay. Are you guys seeing everything? Okay. Just seeing my screen and my picture?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I have so much information to share with you guys today. It's probably going to be information overload kind of scenario, but I am just really excited to be here and be able to share not only some of the things I've shared in the past with the group, but also just a lot of my new knowledge and experience that I've gained. My practice at this point is about 90 to 95% focused on working with people who have mast cell, and most of those people also have Lyme and mold illness. So I've really gained a lot of experience and kind of have some new nuggets of wisdom, hopefully, to share with you guys today. If you've heard me talk in the past, hopefully there'll be something new here for you today. And we're going to kind of touch on a broad spectrum of things. But the basic, concept of today that I want you to take away is just sort of how can you get to a more stable place? How can you reduce reactions and identify and treat the root causes? Some of those root causes you guys already know, of course. Joanne shared a little bit about my personal story, but from a health perspective, to give you an idea of, what my journey has been like. And I know a lot of you have heard my story in the past. For those of you who haven't, short version is that I was in a car accident in 2008 that kicked off a lot of symptoms for me. I went from a fairly healthy, functioning person to a very sick person, and got worse and worse over the course of about 5 years, and then ended up having to quit my corporate job. And then I finally figured out that I had Lyme. I went through what many of you guys went through with being diagnosed with a lot of different autoimmune conditions, RA, fibro, MS, things like that, before I really got to my real diagnosis. So that was in about August of 2013. And at that point, I started really aggressive treatment because that's what you do, right? You're like, oh, I finally figured out what's wrong with me and I need to fix it. And so you start this treatment and you're just gung ho. And, I think my first course of treatment was, several different antibiotics and several different herbal tinctures and all kinds of stuff. So I did a very aggressive treatment and unfortunately it just kept getting worse and worse for like 2 years of treating. And at that point, I really wasn't cognitively aware enough, and I hadn't done enough research, wasn't really ingrained in this community enough to really understand what was going on. I was just told by my practitioners that I was going through a herx and that I could just push through it, and then eventually it would be fine. And it just wasn't. Later I was diagnosed with SIRS. We were living in a moldy house and I didn't know it, so that was playing a role in my symptoms. But essentially, I just started becoming more and more reactive to things, to my environment, to smells, to foods. A lot of my supplements and medications, I was starting to notice were having, very specific adverse reactions. I was getting rashes all over my body. My symptoms were just off the charts across the board. I was pretty debilitated. I know a lot of you in the group, have known me for a long time. But when I was at my sickest, I was very sick. I was basically bedbound, couldn't drive. Couldn't get to the bathroom by myself, holding on to walls. I was about 100 pounds, lost a lot of weight. I was at a very unhealthy weight. I had extreme anxiety and brain fog and depression and insomnia. I was sleeping maybe 2 or 3 hours a night. Really extreme pain, like 9 out of 10 pain all day, every day. All of the things that you guys deal with. So I've been there, and I know what you're going through and what you go through on a daily basis. So anyways, without getting more into that, what really has turned me around in the last 4 or 5 years is actually putting a pause on what I was doing and taking a step backwards and really identifying this mast cell piece a little bit more. So I actually stopped all of my antimicrobial treatments. I stopped my detox stuff, and all I did was focus in on immune modulation and stabilization. So stabilizing my immune system. And that's when I really started to notice that I was getting some symptom relief where I had gotten no symptom relief before this at all. So for the last 4 or 5 years, I've really made steady progress. All my symptoms are slowly going down, 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 and I'm slowly becoming more and more functional and able to get back to a more normal life. Not quite there yet, but still working my way there. And as I mentioned, when we first started, about 90% of my practice is all focused on mast cells. So this is really my area that I live in on a daily basis. So here's all the things we're going to talk about today. I won't spend too much time on this slide, but basically we're going to define mast cell and histamine. We're going to talk about all the symptoms and how to diagnose it. We're going to talk about treating mast cells. So how do you get your reactions down and get to a more stable place and stop reacting to absolutely everything? I'm going to talk about the nervous system connection to mast cell and dietary recommendations. I'm going to talk a lot about antihistamines and mast cell stabilizers, the ones that I find work the best. We're going to talk brand names and give you dosages and all of that good stuff. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about just general guidelines. Whoops, sorry. General guidelines from a, now my thing is frozen, general guidelines from a detox and treatment standpoint. So here's my first slide. So, oops, and now we're back to that one. Okay. Come on. Sorry, you guys, my presentation is moving slowly. So the first slide is going to basically give you the difference between mast cell activation and histamine intolerance. And it can be really difficult to tell between the two because they have a lot of the same symptoms. But essentially, this is sort of the spectrum of these disorders. There's mastocytosis, which is sort of like the worst case scenario. This is not as common, very rare. Typically it's a genetic thing. It's proliferation of mast cells. So basically the body makes too many mast cells. It's very highly tied into bone marrow cancer. and it takes a bone marrow biopsy to diagnose. So this is not as common. It's probably not what, 98% of us are dealing with. Most of us are dealing with mast cell activation syndrome or histamine intolerance. So with mast cell activation syndrome, there's no proliferation of mast cells. So there's not too many mast cells usually. Sometimes there are, but usually not. It's usually that the mast cells are overreactive and they're overstimulated and they're releasing a lot of mediators, or they're creating degranulation, which essentially means that they're releasing mediators. So what are mediators? Mediators are inflammatory molecules that help to raise inflammation in the body. So things like histamine, leukotrienes, prostaglandins, cytokines, interleukins, all of that kind of stuff. A lot of different cytokines, and essentially these make us very sensitive to everything. So we'll get into more details on symptoms in a minute. So histamine intolerance. So the difference between mast cell activation and histamine intolerance is very narrow, and it's really tough to define, but here's how I've defined it. When the amount of histamine is greater than the body's ability to break it down, leading to chronically high circulating and gut histamine issues, likely related to a genetic predisposition. So this is usually tied to the fact that your body isn't making enough enzymes. Special enzymes help to break down histamine in the gut so it doesn't build up. That enzyme is DAO. So there's a couple of genes that play into our body's ability to manufacture DAO and use DAO. So if those genes have SNPs or mutations on them, then you could have some histamine intolerance. Now, not everybody with mast cell activation has histamine intolerance, meaning not everybody with mast cell activation has a DAO or some other SNP that creates that syndrome. The other way you can get histamine intolerance is simply by dysbiosis. So there are certain gut bacteria that break down histamine and certain gut bacteria that produce histamine. We're going to kind of talk about the differences of those here in a minute. So let's start with the basics. So what are mast cells? Make sure everybody's kind of on the same page before we dive into all of the detail stuff. So what are mast cells? They are essentially white blood cells. They're found in all of the tissues of the body, but they're most abundant in skin, lungs, and the digestive tract, particularly also around the blood vessels and the nerves and around the blood-brain barrier. So really important things, right? When they are triggered, they will release all of these different mediators. What are they triggered by? So they're triggered by IgE and IgG antibodies. So certain types of allergies an allergy response will trigger mast cell activation. They're triggered by antigens, especially parasites and Bartonella. Parasites and Bartonella are probably the two top of the list as far as pathogens go that trigger mast cell activation. Viruses are up there as well. Drugs, foods, certain foods, chemical toxins, environmental toxins, that would of course include mold. Sometimes even things like physical activity, temperature change, or even hormonal imbalances. So those are other things that will also trigger mast cells. And we're going to talk about all of those things here today. So just to kind of give you an overview of symptoms, when you look at the symptom chart, you're gonna go, wow, well, I could have all of these just because I have Lyme or mold, and that's true. And there's a lot of overlap, and that's why it can be sort of hard to identify how much is mast cell playing in a role in your illness. But just to kind of give you an overview, so on the skin, the big signs for mast cell activation are flushing, redness, warmness to the touch, itching, hives, that kind of stuff. Pain, so any kind of pain, joint pain, nerve pain, throbbing pain, stabbing pains. Cardiovascularly, we get heart racing and heart palpitations, low blood pressure and tachycardia. POTS syndrome is definitely tied to mast cell activation. There's a big tie there. Edema is often another cause, so fluid retention. Neurologically, there's a big role with mast cells because they line the blood-brain barrier. Headaches and migraines can have a mast cell component to them. Brain fog, anxiety, depression, irritability, vertigo, chronic fatigue, all of the respiratory stuff, right? So these are like real typical sort of hay fever type symptoms. GI tract, so there's a lot of mast cells that line the GI tract, so there is a really big play in the gut. Nausea, stomach pains, stomach cramps, bloating, constipation, diarrhea, Colitis and Crohn's are really, really highly linked to mast cell activation. And then just general, dysbiosis, things like yeast and fungal overgrowth in the gut and SIBO and H. pylori, all that kind of stuff. And there is a little bit of tie into things like endometriosis, interstitial cystitis, and as well as PMS. So that was a lot of symptoms, and you can see that they're like systemic symptoms. It's not just about, hay fever, like a typical allergy symptom. And that's why they can be difficult to identify, because I think a lot of people think about histamine as, an allergic response, right? You get rashes or you get the hay fever type symptoms. But a mast cell response is much more systemic. And one of the reasons a mast cell response is much more systemic is because there's a really big connection between histamine and leaky gut. And so we know that histamine is something that actually makes the gut barrier more permeable, and that's intentional. So a normal function in the gut would be that proper amounts or appropriate amounts of serotonin and histamine release in the gut, and that gives the gut a little bit of permeability, just enough for those nutrients to go through and for us to absorb our nutrients. So that's the way it's supposed to work. But when you have mast cell activation or histamine intolerance, what happens is there's excess histamine release, not enough breaking down of histamine. And so there's just basically excess histamine in the gut. And what that does is increase the permeability. So it increases the leakiness, so to speak, of the gut, which means that food proteins, toxins, pathogens, things that are supposed to stay inside the gut can now go into the bloodstream, which means that we would get a systemic inflammatory response, which were all the symptoms that we just saw on the previous page. So, the big takeaway essentially is that histamine plays a really big role in healing the gut. So it's difficult to heal the gut if you've got histamine issues going on. So before we go any further, I want to kind of just make sure we're all on the same page with this analogy. I know a lot of you have heard about the inflammation analogy. I'm going to just grab my phone to make sure I'm staying on track time-wise, because I tend to be an over talker. So, okay. So histamine and inflammation bucket. So a lot of you might have heard of an analogy, the inflammation bucket, right? You say my bucket is overflowing. I'm always full, meaning your inflammation is always high, and one thing gets added to it and it's just even worse right away, right? So when you think about this sort of bucket analogy, you want to think about essentially your body's ability to house inflammation, resides in quote unquote a bucket. And if you think about that as total inflammation or just histamine alone, we want your bucket to be very low, so that when you encounter things that could trigger inflammation, like mold or chemicals or foods, that your bucket doesn't raise all the way up to the top, it just raises a little bit. When it gets to the top and overflows, that's when we get things like major histamine release and food reactions, and pushes you over to the edge in a flare, right? So we always want to keep that bucket of inflammation low. But there's a lot of things that fill up the bucket. And so this is kind of what this slide is about. So things that will fill up that histamine bucket are digestion. Just any digesting, just eating food releases histamine. Like I said on the previous slide, that's a normal thing. But we need to keep that in mind when some people say I'm allergic or I feel like I'm histamine sensitive to anything I eat. Well, there's a reason for that, because histamine gets released every time you eat, no matter what foods you're eating. Hormonal changes are also internal sources of of things that fill up the bucket. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today, but estrogen particularly is the big hitter there. Estrogen really increases mast cell activation in a big way. There's a huge connection there. And so when you are in a state of estrogen dominance or you have excess estrogen happening, that will definitely fill up your bucket faster. Pathogen activity, right? So viruses, bacteria, parasites, as they're active, they release biotoxins. Biotoxins ignite an inflammatory response. So that fills up our bucket. And then same thing, toxic load in general. So, mycotoxins, heavy metals, glyphosate. We walk through a store and we get all the chemical smells coming through, right? All of those things are going to fill up our bucket. And then external sources of things that fill up our bucket are things like histamine containing foods and drinks, which we'll talk about in a minute. So some foods and drinks actually contain high amounts of histamine. Highly inflammatory foods, pollen, mold, and environmental allergies, chemical sensitivities, medications and supplements. We're going to talk a lot about medications and supplements today too. And oftentimes you are taking things that could be triggering histamine for you. And then I want to just talk about, whoops, sorry. I want to just talk about what I call the buildup effect. So sometimes the bucket is kind of teetering on the very top and it's not totally overflown. So you're not in a full blown, mast cell flare at that time. But there often is what I call a buildup effect where histamine and mast cell reactions are very dose dependent, right? Meaning it all adds up. So a little bit of something might be okay, right? It doesn't overflow your bucket, but a combination of all of these things here, like say you eat some high histamine foods and then you go to the library and you get exposed to mold and then you go to the, the grocery store and you walk through the chemical aisle. Okay, none of us actually do this, but this is just an example, right? Or you take a new medication or a new supplement that triggers you. All of those things add up. You have a stressful event in your life. All of those things, add up essentially to overflow the bucket. So essentially it's very dose dependent, which is also why it can be difficult to identify what your triggers are. Because some days, and people will tell me this all the time, well, some days I can eat an avocado and other days I can't, right? And that's because the days that you can't, your bucket's already full. So you have that avocado, your bucket overflows. The days that you can are days where your bucket's a little bit lower. So you got a little bit more, room there essentially. So hopefully that makes sense for you guys. All right, so how do you know if you have mast cell activation? So like we talked about all those symptoms, it can be really difficult to identify which ones are mast cell and which ones are more just like my normal Lyme and mold symptoms, right? And the answer is it can still be hard. Sorry, I keep doing that. It can still be hard, but here are some things that I do, right? So diagnostic testing can definitely be done. It's not always the most accurate. There's a lot of nuances to diagnostic testing for mast cell. All of the samples have to be handled in a very, very specific way. So if the lab doesn't do those exact methods for treatment of your blood and urine, then we're not going to get an accurate reading. And so these are the biomarkers that you can have a doctor run if you want to. I would say that probably only 50% of the people I work with will test elevated on one or more of these biomarkers, especially things like histamine and tryptase. A lot of people I work with do have elevated histamine in the blood or an elevated tryptase or elevated prostaglandins, but a lot of people do not and don't test elevated for it. Just because you don't test elevated for it does not mean you don't have mast cell activation. So there's some other things that I'm going to walk you through that can be helpful in identifying if you do. Essentially, mast cell activation, in my opinion, is a clinical diagnosis. And so these are some of the things that I look for when I'm trying to decipher, is mast cell activation playing a role in your symptoms? So if you're highly sensitive or reactive to treatment, so if you're someone who feels like you're just herxing nonstop and you're not tolerating treatment, like you take one little drop of a remedy and you have a herx for, a week, like that's not normal. That's not a normal herx, right? So a herx essentially is a short-term elevation in inflammation where toxin levels go up, you have an inflammatory response, and then that comes back down to your baseline. So that should be something like 24 to 48 hours. Maybe even just a few hours. Somebody who takes one drop of something and has a herx for the next week, that's not a herx. That is a mast cell reaction. So those are the things that you want to watch for. So if you're someone who feels like you're not tolerating treatments, you're really, really sensitive, and you feel like you're not making any progress, that treatment is just making you worse, that's definitely a really big clue to me that mast cell activation might be playing a role in your symptoms. Rashes and hives are like a dead giveaway for mast cells. So if you're having rashes and hives, definitely you're having some type of mast cell activation happening. Any types of symptoms if you have symptoms that increase post mealtime, that's another really big sign that you're having mast cell activation. So if you get headaches after you eat, if you get flushed or hot after you eat, if your heart races after you eat, if you feel anxious or tired or irritable after you eat, all of those things can be signs that mast cell activation is playing a role in your symptoms. But probably one of the best ways to tell is actually one of the ways that the Mastocytosis Society has set up in their actual diagnosis criteria. So this is part of the diagnosis criteria to be diagnosed with mast cell activation. Symptoms are reduced when given antihistamines or mast cell stabilizers. So if you take an antihistamine or mast cell stabilizer, do some of your symptoms get a little bit better? And if they do, then there's definitely a mast cell or histamine response playing a role in your symptoms. And it can be tough to find which are the right antihistamines and mast cell stabilizers. We're going to talk a lot about that today. So before we get into that, I want to give you, I'm going to talk a little bit more about diagnostics here in just a second too. So I want to just give you my overview, sort of my approach for treating mast cell activation and treating chronic Lyme in general, right? So this is a very like step-by-step methodical process that I have sort of sussed out over the last 6 years in working with mast cell activation folks. I've now worked with, oh gosh, hundreds, probably 400 to 500 or so people who have mast cell activation. So I've just got a lot of experiences that I've seen that are patterns in people that I've used to sort of develop this approach that I have that I'm going to share with you today. So first you want to do some diagnostic testing. Let's get as much information as we can, because sometimes we don't have enough information to really know what's going on, especially people who are being treated only on muscle testing. I love muscle testing. I think that there's a really great and strong importance for muscle testing, especially with chronic Lyme. But I really like to use diagnostics and muscle testing together to really identify everything, because I think there are limitations to muscle testing, just like there are limitations to diagnostics. So if you do both, I feel like you're able to get a more complete picture of what's really going on. So I'm a big fan of some diagnostic tests, which I'll share with you in a minute. The second step that I walk people through is removing your triggers that are in your control. So there are a lot of triggers that really aren't in our control, but there are some that we can have some control over, right? So those are things like diet, supplements and medications, your environment, and your lifestyle. So we're going to talk a lot about that today. The third step, after you remove all the triggers, potential triggers to mast cell activation that are in your control, is to stabilize, calm and modulate the immune system and the nervous system. I also put balance hormones in this same category, because balancing those hormones is really part of modulating and calming the immune system and the nervous system as well. So that kind of is all, I call that the stabilization, time. And a lot of people will spend a lot of time on that step. So like when I stopped treatment 5 years ago, I just stopped all antimicrobials, stopped all my crazy binders and detox stuff. And I just kind of started from square one, and I just focused on things that would help to reduce inflammation and stabilize my system, calm and stabilize my mast cells. And I probably stayed in that space for a year before I added any type of detox or antimicrobial type things. And then it took me still another year before I was really back to treating tick-borne infections again. So it can be a really slow process, but it's really important to get that inflammation under control so that you're able to tolerate treatment down the line. This is super important to do before doing antimicrobial treatments. Reduce overall toxic burden is the next step. So fourth step essentially is to detox. So that toxic burden will constantly trigger your mast cells. We want to get all the toxins down as much as possible. So that's the detox process. And then it's really the antimicrobial treatments. So last are the antimicrobial treatments. And everybody, some people need a slightly different version of this approach. I customize my approach when I work with everybody individually. Not everybody's exactly the same, but this is generally the steps that I follow. So now we're going to talk about each of these steps. Here comes all the information, you guys. So get your notes ready, but you're going to get my slides. So don't feel like you have to jot all this down, because it's going to be a lot of detail. I wanted you guys to have a tool that you could refer back to with lots of details. So this is what you will get. So step one. So step one is determining the root cause and doing some diagnostics. Diagnostics I do for food sensitivities, I really like the MRT test. And the reason why is because it is testing mediators. Mediators are the things that get released from mast cells. So things like histamine, leukotrienes, prostaglandins, cytokines, all of those things are mediators. And that's essentially what the MRT test is testing, it's testing for volumetric change in mediator release. So I find in my practice that it's the most highly correlated to mast cell activation. I also like to use it because it has a chemical section that gives us some food chemicals that translate also into fillers for supplements and medications. So there's a few fillers that are listed on there. Why else do I like to use it? It's pretty comprehensive. It's 170 different foods and food chemicals. I do like to pair that with an IgG food sensitivity panel, and an IgE if you have typical standard allergies. Most people I work with don't. Most people have just mediator food allergies or IgG allergies. If you're going to do an IgG panel, I like doing Great Plains, Cyrex or Dunwoody are also good labs. So those two combined together can kind of give us a comprehensive look at what foods could be triggering you and filling up that histamine bucket. Environmentally, testing your environment for mold is obviously like so important. So I like the mycometrics, Hertz me, ERMI, you guys already know about that. Obviously testing and having an inspector come out to the house is really important. EMF testing, also really important. We're going to talk about some of this stuff later, but there's a really great EMF expert there in Denver, Ryan Ashley, and he'll come out and inspect your whole place. I got his information on a slide coming up here, so we'll talk about that in a minute. But mold and EMFs are two things that we would definitely want to test for in your environment. We want to test your hormones, especially estrogen and cortisol. So estrogen and cortisol are two of the really strong hormones that will elicit a mast cell response and are tied to mast cell activation, especially estrogen. And men, you're not out of the woods when it comes to estrogen. You can also have estrogen dominance as well. So I like using the Dutch test for this because it gives us a more complete picture of your hormones. It actually looks not only at your primary hormones like you get on a serum test through your doctor, but it also gives you the hormone metabolism. So how are those hormones being broken down in your body? How are they being detoxed? And how they're being used. So that's really important because then it tells us what tools might be most effective in balancing your hormones. So love the Dutch complete test. I feel like it's one of my favorite tools. So is the MRT. Genetic mutations. So you can test for genetic mutations. These are the genetic mutations that are most tied to mast cell. I'm not going to go into all of these today because it's just too much detailed information. But these are the ones to look for. If you have mutations on any of these can play a role in mast cell activation. I like to use the 23andMe and run it through the LiveWello platform to get all of the right information out of it. Micronutrient deficiency panels can also be really helpful. There are certain micronutrients that we need in order to make things like DAO in the body. So DAO is the enzyme that breaks down histamine. Copper and B6 are both used to make DAO. So we want to make sure we've got those. Other important nutrients from a mast cell standpoint are zinc, B12, choline, calcium, and folate, BH4 as well. I like the SpectraCell micronutrient panel. All right, so here's a little bit more detailed information on other testing. So these are more like the root cause testing stuff, right? So we've got SIRS, mold illness. You guys know all of these markers here. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on these, but these are the ones that I typically look at. Viral activity. So this tells us if there's viruses playing a role in triggering your mast cells. Parasites. Parasites are a huge trigger to mast cell activation. I can't tell you how much my symptoms improved after I treated parasites. A serious process treating parasites, but it was very helpful for me. Dysbiosis in SIBO, so bacterial imbalances and overgrowth of bacteria in the small intestine, that really will trigger histamine in a big way. And then actually I don't have it listed on here, but the GI map stool test is the more comprehensive stool test that I like to use. And it also looks at yeast and fungal overgrowth. I also like using the organic acids test. I feel like it has a more accurate way to look at specifically yeast and fungus, but it has a lot of other really great helpful markers on there too. And then Lyme. So as we all know, and I won't go into this with you guys because I'm in the good company who understands Lyme and Lyme testing. Lyme testing can be difficult. So you guys know what the best things are. I prefer the DNA connections PCR test. Or muscle or energetic testing. I find that those two are the most accurate when actually picking up these infections. When we think about tick-borne infections, Bartonella is the biggest trigger to mast cells. Almost everybody that I work with who has Lyme, who has mast cell activation, likely has Bartonella, it's playing a big role. Same thing with parasites from me when I treated Bartonella, or same thing with Bartonella. When I treated Bartonella, my mast cell symptoms went way down. So it's a really, really big trigger. Okay, so that was step one, diagnostics. So step two are removing all of the triggers that are in your control. So what are the triggers that are in our control? So our environment is definitely kind of first on the list. We want to make sure we're living in a clean environment. So molds, you guys know all about this. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that because you guys are already experts, but you want to make sure that you're living in a mold-free space or a low mold space. You will not get better unless you are out of molds. I mean, I can't tell you how many people I've worked with who they've tried everything, and nothing is working. They're not getting better. And I can think of a few examples in my head right now. But when they got out of their environment, things started shifting. So if you're someone who is living somewhere and everything you are trying, you're reacting to, even like antihistamines and mast cell stabilizers. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. If you're someone who's reacting to antihistamines and mast cell stabilizers, it could mean that your bucket is constantly full. So anything coming in is going to give you a trigger. And your bucket is constantly full because you're living in an environment that is keeping that bucket full and it's keeping you triggered. So mold is one of those really big ones that you guys all know you have to be very careful about. And then environmental chemicals. Reducing chemical exposure as much as possible. So you guys know all of these types of things too, right? So clean and organic personal care products and cleaning products. The Think Dirty app is great. I know Jen gave us that as a resource several years ago, and I still use it. It's really nice. Plastics, so definitely want to reduce plastics as much as possible. They contain xenoestrogens that can actually trigger histamine. Pesticides, definitely something that will fill up that bucket, that inflammatory bucket. VOCs, a lot of us who have mast cell activation and chemical sensitivity are really sensitive to smells and VOCs coming off of things. So that's like, typically new things, right? Flooring, paint, furniture, all of that kind of stuff. More part in step number 2, removing the triggers in your control. So EMFs and dirty electricity after mold are probably the next and most biggest trigger in your environment that we're all dealing with, especially these days now that 5G has been installed practically everywhere. We're really getting triggered from all over the place. And if you think that you are not sensitive to EMFs or dirty electricity, you're probably wrong. I hate to say it like that, but all of us are sensitive on some level because we're just bombarded by this stuff. So you might not be ultra sensitive and really notice it, but it's likely playing a role in triggering inflammation in your body and keeping that bucket, high and overflowing, like we talked about. I find that EMFs are a really big trigger to histamine. In fact, when 5G got installed in Denver, when we were living there, last year, it got put in our neighborhood. And as soon as it got put in, I had itchy eyes, like itchy red eyes, swollen, puffy red face, like overnight, all of a sudden, without changing anything else. And we tracked it down to, to 5G essentially. So my mast cells really, really got triggered when 5G got installed right in our neighborhood. So it's definitely no joke. If you haven't done your research on it, it's definitely something you want to dive into. I've got a few slides on this because I think it's so important. So electromagnetic frequencies or fields is what EMFs are. And where do these come from? So you guys know this: power lines, cell phones, Wi-Fi, computers, cell towers, television, baby monitors, smart meters, smart anything. Those of you who have like Ring installed at your home or any of those other kind of smart home tools, they're super cool and super fun, but they also probably could be triggering some inflammation in your body. Gosh darn it, Billy. Okay, dirty electricity. So what's dirty electricity? So it's a little bit different than EMFs. It's a special type of EMF. Essentially, it's when power lines and wiring within our home contain frequencies other than the normal 60 hertz electrical current. So if you have like buzzing sounds, like if any of your electronics, make buzzing sounds, like your refrigerator, freezer is a big one that always makes the buzzing sound, that's dirty electricity. We're going to talk about some of the sources of dirty electricity, but solar system converters are big sources of dirty electricity. I know, big bummer there. Any of the smart home appliances or gadgets or gizmos. Dimmer lights are big sources of dirty electricity. So take a look at your dimmer lights, and then LED bulbs. So LED bulbs are also really big triggers, unfortunately. So switching back to incandescents can reduce that a bit. So how do you know if you're sensitive to EMFs? I'm going to just give you all of these different symptoms, right? And I'm not going to read through them all because a lot of these are symptoms that you might think are just your normal, Lyme symptoms. But when you reduce EMF and dirty electricity, you might notice that some of these get better without actually treating Lyme. So some of these symptoms, while some of them can be tied directly into Lyme or tick-borne illnesses, some of them can also be from electrohypersensitivity. So lots of different things here. You can see very systemic, set of symptoms here. Sorry, I'm going to move quickly because I have so much information today. So removing triggers still, so more on EMFs and dirty electricity. So trying to identify your exposures. You can get like a meter off of Amazon. The Cornet 8088T is one that works pretty well for home inspection, or you can actually have somebody come out and professionally inspect everything around your property. The local guy there who's the expert is Ryan Ashley. I really trust him and like the work I see that he does. So he is great. You can just put his stuff into Google and you'll get his website. And he'll come out and inspect your place and tell you exactly what needs to be changed and how to change it. So these are the goals for the readings. If you do the at-home reading and get your own meter and try to figure some things out that way, then these are kind of some of the readings that you want to look out for. So how do we reduce or neutralize these things? So some of the big things that you can do are switching from Wi-Fi to hardwire. So hardwiring your home can make such a huge difference. That's what we did when we moved here. And man, I mean, it's a huge difference. In Denver, when I would be working and I'd be doing, Zoom sessions all day, but at the end of the day, I'd really have kind of a headache and I feel fatigued and, kind of irritable and run down. And here it's much different. So I don't get as drained and I don't get as symptomatic sitting in front of the computer all day long. So hardwiring can make a big difference. If you can't do that, at a minimum, everyone should shut off their Wi-Fi at night. You got to unplug that router every single night. If that sounds like a big hassle, put it on a timer. You can actually get the same timer that will turn like lights on and off can also turn, the Wi-Fi on and off at night. So that way you don't have to think about it. But this is super, super, super important. I keep wanting to highlight things and then I go to the next slide. Sorry. Okay. Then using your own router. So this is a big one. Nancy Brown actually pointed this one out to me, Dr. Nancy Brown. So the routers that get distributed by Xfinity are actually like a little personal like hotspot or cell tower, so to speak. So the EMF readings that come off of those routers are significantly higher than buying your own router. So do not use the Xfinity distributed router. Go ahead and buy your own router. And do not rent theirs. Use RouterGuard. So lessemf.com is a great place to buy some of these devices. There is a little guard you can put around your router that can help to mitigate some of that. Smart and Bluetooth devices should all be unplugged at night as well. And then obviously disabling any smart home technologies in the evening time, if you can, is the other one to go. And I know these are tough things. These are tough things to get family members and spouses on board with. I totally get it, but they can make a really big difference in helping to stabilize your condition. Dirty electricity. So we talked a little bit about the LED bulbs, the dimmer switchers, the dimmer switches. There's also these filters that you can I'll have one up here in my office so it'll show you that you can plug into your outlet that neutralizes the dirty electricity around the house. And so those you can find on Amazon. They're Graham Stetzer filters is what they're called, and they essentially neutralize dirty electricity. All right. So more, I know there's a lot of slides on EMF and dirty electricity. That's how important it is. So adding protection. So these are just other ways. So again, I'm going to let you guys kind of, research these on your own. I just wanted to give you this information because it's just so important. But some of the things that I've come across that I've either used myself or I have, clients who have used. So I wait until a lot of clients tell me, yeah, this brand is great. And then I go, okay, I have a lot of people who find this works well because there's so many different if you go online, it's put in like EMF protection, ridiculous amount of products and services come up, products particularly, and who knows which ones work and which ones don't. So these are ones that, that I've either used personally or that I have several clients who are using and having some success. So there's a EMF protective paint, especially for your bedroom and sleeping at night, to give your brain and body that, break from those EMFs. The brand is called EMF Shield. You can also buy protective canopies for your beds. People who are the most hyper electrosensitive and people who have the worst insomnia, this is an amazing, amazing tool to have. They're not cheap, but they are worth it. I mean, really, really worth it. I've seen people really completely change around not only their sleep patterns, but just their overall inflammation by being able to spend some time inside a canopy where they're protected from EMF and dirty electricity for at least part of the day. There are some whole house systems that are supposed to neutralize dirty electricity throughout the whole house, or neutralize EMF and protect you from EMF and 5G. So the Soma Vedic is something that is a little bit newer to me. I haven't tried it personally, but I have about a dozen clients who use it that I've come across so far, and everyone says that they feel like it has helped. So you can look that up online. It basically protects from EMF and 5G, and it's a little it uses crystals, actually. It's really interesting. I don't even know. I don't even think I can explain it, but go to somavedic.com and you can check it out. It's pretty cool. The Sign Tamer is something that you can use for your whole house system to tame dirty electricity. I also like Conscious Copper. So if you go to consciouscopper.com, they have little plugins that you can put on your cell phone and iPad and stuff like that. They also have whole house systems that you can place this little tiny copper thing in various rooms. And copper is something that helps to neutralize dirty electricity and EMFs. So lots of good stuff. As far as device hygiene, there's a ton of things that you can do to protect, from your device too, right? We're all attached to our cell phones, trying to keep them at least 1 foot away as much as possible, always trying to keep them, not right against you. Definitely don't want it up to your ear, in your bra, or in your pocket. Turning off the 5G and the 4G. So you can actually, depending on what phone you have, so some of the new phones you can't do this, but some phones you can actually downgrade. So like on my phone, I went down to using 4G. It's set to use 5G, but I can get it down to 4G. That's the lowest it'll let me go. So you can adapt what your phone is using. Turning off Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, or using airplane mode, super important on your phone. I say, shut it all the way off at night, and don't have it plugged in at night next to you while you sleep. I know a lot of people are in that habit, but that's another way to sort of just have an electronic next to you. Consider using a landline. I know, totally old school, but if you're super sensitive to your phone, and I have a lot of people who are, that might be a good way to go. Air tube headphones are really great. A lot of people really like those. There's also like shields and stuff that you can put around your actual cell phone or around your tablet. So lots of things to look at there. I'll get into that in a minute. Okay, so now we're on to supplements and medications. So we're still talking about triggers. So these are more things that could be triggering you and contributing to overflowing that histamine bucket and contributing to mast cell activation. These are all the things that you want to examine to figure out what else is contributing to your mast cell activation. So when we think about supplements and medications, what I find in almost everybody that I initially start working with, there's usually a few supplements at least, or many supplements that they're taking that have histaminic ingredients in them, have inactive ingredients, that fillers that are just also trigger histamine, or various things that will trigger histamine in different ways. So a lot of the things that you take might actually not be the right choices for you. So you want to try to find very clean formulations. Essentially, everything has to be really looked at. So when I start working with someone, I'll take your supplement list. I will go look at every formulation of all the supplements that you're taking and identify which ones I think could be contributing to mast cell or could be triggering mast cell activation. So it doesn't mean you can't take that item. It just means we have to find you a different version of that item that has a cleaner formulation. Although occasionally, sometimes you can't take that item. So Google is a great place to look up, fillers on your prescription medications. Obviously, all our our supplements have the inactive ingredients listed there. But just use Google and look up the inactive ingredients on your prescription medications. If you type in fillers, you won't get a good result. So you want to type in inactive ingredients. So, you put in, levothyroxine, you put in levothyroxine, inactive ingredients, and then you'll get a list there. One thing to look at also is that sometimes pharmacies will switch manufacturers. You guys have that happen where it's like you're filling your levothyroxine and at one point it's a white pill and all of a sudden you pick it up and it's a blue pill, right? So they've switched manufacturers. Make sure that you know who your manufacturers are and let the pharmacy know that you have a manufacturer specific, request, and your doctor can help make sure that your actual prescription mentions that so that they can stock that particular product. So other things to watch for. So any supplement that has a lot of active ingredients. So many of us are on these supplements that are really broad spectrum and they have like 10 different things in them that are all right, helping to support like say liver detox, right? And then we've got 8 or 10 different ingredients in there. I don't like using those formulations for people who have mast cell because there's so many different things in there and we don't know which one of those things could be triggering you. I really like to, when possible, work with single active ingredient supplements or maybe a few active ingredients at most, especially for my most sensitive people. So the simpler the formulation, the better. Alcohol-based tinctures. So alcohol is something that will trigger mast cell activation. So if you're on a ton of tinctures, you could be, giving yourself enough alcohol that could be triggering mast cell activation. And of course, increasing your histamine levels because alcohol is high histamine. So switching to, glycerin-based tinctures or powders or a capsule would be, a way to go. These are some of the ones that I find on the fillers in both pharmaceutical and in supplements that are the worst ones. So these are the worst ones. There's a lot of other ones, but these are probably some of the most common and some of the worst that you definitely want to watch out for. So any of the dyes, so that would say, F, D, and C, and then it would have a color and a number usually. Anything that is a phthalate or a stearate. So magnesium stearate and vegetable stearates are in a ton of stuff. A lot of people are really sensitive to stearates. Titanium dioxide, polysorbate 80, stearic acid and citric acid, benzoic acid, cornstarch, anything that says natural flavoring or anything that says flavoring in general even, that's something that can be triggering. Anything that says wax, has a wax to it. Ascorbyl palmate is one that's really commonly used. If you're really sensitive to corn, ascorbyl palmate is a corn derivative. And so you really want to watch for that one. It's a really, really common one. So if corn is something that will trigger you, you want to stay away from supplements that include that filler. So is there a way to test for filler sensitivities? I get this question all the time. So to my knowledge, there's not like a comprehensive test that just looks at all of the fillers. There are some that we can find on various tests. So for example, the MRT, which I mentioned, that's one of the reasons I like to use the MRT is because it does include some of these things. So it includes benzoates, polysorbate 80, it includes a lot of the dyes, it includes sorbic acid, it includes lecithin. And then, the other thing that there's a couple other tests that we'll talk about in a minute that also can be helpful for this. But also, don't discount your food sensitivities. So a lot of people, for some reason, they'll say, well, I can't have olive oil, but then we'll look at their supplements and there's olive leaf or olive oil in one of their supplements. It's like, oh, well, that's in my supplement. Well, that's something that you should not have. So if a food sensitivity test shows you're sensitive to olive, you should not have olive in your supplements, even in those tiny doses. So you want to sort of use your food sensitivity tests to help you with supplement choices as well. So ideally, the plan that I walk people through is we identify all of the suspicious items, and some of those might be okay, but we want to pull out anything that could be a potential trigger. We want to work on stabilizing the immune system, which we're going to talk about next, and then we add these items back in one at a time and trial them and see if you feel like you're tolerating them or not. Sometimes it's really tough to tell until you take everything out, stabilize, and then add everything back in. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about diet. So this is the other sort of big hitter that is in your control. So the food that goes into your mouth is obviously in your control. When it comes to diet, I could do an entire webinar just on the low histamine diet and eating for mast cell activation. So again, this will be a lot of information these next few slides, but hopefully you can refer back to it and use this as a good resource. So you want to adopt a low histamine diet, but low histamine diet isn't the end all be all. And maybe a lot of practitioners wouldn't say that, but I think it's a really good starting place. But I like using it only as a starting place and then modifying that diet based on each individual person. And the way that I modify it is I use food sensitivity testing. So I use the MRT and the IgG testing to identify which foods might be safe and which foods are not safe, and modifying that sort of low histamine diet template. Because sometimes there are some higher histamine foods that you're actually tolerating pretty well and that you could have here and there, and not have a reaction. And not everybody is the same. Some people won't respond to a low histamine diet. And so identifying what your particular triggers are is really important. And when it comes to leaky gut, as we know, any food can essentially be a trigger, right? So if your intestine is permeable and you're having leaky gut, those food proteins are going to go in the bloodstream and the immune system is going to create an IgG response to that food. And then IgG triggers mast cells. So, there's a big connection into that. And that's why everybody's food intolerances are very different. Some of the other intolerances or categories of intolerant foods I've listed here for you. So besides high histamine foods, the ones that I find that are bigger problems, more commonly problems for those with mast cell activation are foods high in salicylates or phenols. We'll talk about those in more detail in a minute. High oxalate foods and high glutamate foods. So both oxalates and glutamate will trigger mast cells. Salicylates will trigger leukotrienes, which are one of the mediators that gets released from mast cells, and a couple of the cytokines. So they also really trigger mast cell activation directly as well. So I'll give you more information about that in just a minute. One thing to know about the diet, like I said, is everyone's different. So what works for one person is not going to work for the other. The standard, like just adopt the traditional low histamine diet, might not work for you, and you might have to figure out a different way. So working with a practitioner, using some of these tools that I'm going to give you today can be helpful. Obviously, we always want to choose organic as much as possible. We want to eat whole foods and we want to avoid processed or packaged foods, which are going to be higher in histamine. Portion size, frequency, and timing and environment matter. So what do I mean by that? So this kind of goes back again to that histamine analogy bucket, right? So sometimes you can have a little bit of something, say you have, a little tiny bit of a banana, right? So a ripe banana is going to be a high histamine item. A unripe banana is going to be a moderate histamine item. So say on an average day, you can have a moderate histamine item. So you can have a banana and you have a half a banana and you do just fine. But if you have a whole banana, you don't feel so good, right? So there's definitely a portion size there that sometimes is a sweet spot. Sometimes a little bit of something is okay, but a big, huge portion is not okay. Or maybe it's frequency. So maybe I have a banana on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. All of a sudden by Wednesday, I'm reacting to it. So how much you're having it overall can also play a role in foods. And that's why rotating and variety is as best as you can is really important. And then timing and environment matter. So a lot of people, will say, I reacted to X, Y, and Z, when I went out to eat. Well, you're out to eat. So what else is triggering you while you're in a restaurant, or, what else is triggering you that day in general, right? So if you've had a day where you, for example, introduced a new supplement or a medication that you've reacted to, and then you go and eat that moderate, histamine food, you're probably going to react to it. But on a day where you're not reacting to something else and your bucket isn't all the way full, you're going to be okay. So timing and environment also really matter. Sourcing of meats. So this is also really important. So when we think about meats, a lot of people will say, well, all meats are high histamine. Well, it's really all about how the meats are handled as far as how much histamine they gain. So as you guys know, we want to always choose pasture raised, grass-fed, and wild caught meats and seafoods. The time to slaughter and the time from gutted to flash frozen really, really matter for people, especially people who are the most sensitive to meat. So if you're someone who's like, I can't eat any meat no matter what I try, that's definitely something that I hear. Some people can eat meat and it's not a problem, and they can just buy the regular pasture raised, grass fed beef at Whole Foods, or they can buy pasture raised chicken at Whole Foods or whatever, and they feel fine. But a lot of people are really sensitive to meats. So the sources that I wanted to give you guys today that can help you find ones for the most sensitive meat eating folks are US Wellness Meats. So US Wellness has a process where they basically freeze the meat right after slaughter. So it's a very short time from slaughter to frozen. And that plays a huge role in how much histamine that piece of meat gains. So US Wellness Meats is something you can order online. Getting from like a local, farmer where you're getting it from like an actual ranch or something where they also do the same thing. They freeze it right after they slaughter it. So if you're getting from a local, like you buy half of a cow or whatever, I know a lot of people do that. Ask them like, how much time is this frozen from, after it's slaughtered? So that's really important to know. You want to make sure that that time frame is very short. So US Wellness Meats, if you can't find something locally and you're the most sensitive to meats, that's definitely the place you want to go. I personally use Crowd Cow, and they also use local, ranchers. I've had really good luck with tolerating all of their products. Vital Choice is another one that a lot of my a lot of my clients use. It's a seafood source, and it's wild caught Alaskan king salmon, and it's gutted and flash frozen like right on the boat essentially. So that can be a good source that could be, well tolerated. If you're buying at the store, if you're going to be brave and try any, seafood at the store, don't buy any fresh seafood at the store. Buy it frozen, because it probably has been sitting in that, fresh meat compartment for a while. So try to get it frozen. Overly ripe fruits, so anything that sits for a long period of time, especially fruit, will gain in histamine. So here's kind of the example of that. So like sometimes, for example, I've gotten to the point where I've been including some high histamine foods in my diet. I don't go overboard, but I definitely have histamine foods in my diet. So avocado is one of them. I do the best with an unripe avocado, and limiting myself to about a half. If I have more than that, I find that I get a little bit, intolerant. So half of a slightly unripe avocado, pretty well tolerated, whereas one whole ripe avocado might not be that tolerated. Strawberries that were picked and have been sitting for a long time, things like that. So you want to really eat fruits, right when they're ready, and not overly ripe. Eliminating snacking and considering intermittent fasting. So eating releases histamine. Doesn't mean you shouldn't eat, but if you're someone who like munches throughout the whole day, that may be something that you want to try to trim down and get it more into like 3 or 4 small meals versus, sort of grazing throughout the day. Rotate. So as much as you can rotate and provide variety, the better. I know that so many of us on mast cell are really, really limited. I know when I was at my sickest and most reactive, I think I had like 6 foods or something like that I could eat. It was very, very limited. But as much as you possibly can, rotating, and then introducing new foods when you can. The freezer and the vacuum sealer are your friends. So if you make some food, leftovers are not your friends. So you want to freeze those, or vacuum seal them and freeze them, or freeze them in a freezer safe container, a glass container. All right, so here are the high histamine foods. So I know online there's just so many sources of histamine lists, high histamine food lists. These are, I have a list that I've basically taken from a lot of different online sources, and other sources. These are the big ones that you want to watch out for. And I'm not going to read through all of these because that'll just take a lot of time, and you guys can do that on your own. But I've basically broken it down into the foods that are the biggest hitters from a histamine standpoint out there. And do I have every single high histamine food on here? No, there's probably some that are sort of moderate histamine that I've left off. Most of these are just the really high histamine ones. So, coffee and teas are really, really big. Alcohol, definitely. We talked a lot about the meats before, but obviously anything cured or aged or smoked, you also want to stay away from. Any fermented foods, a lot of different fruits, avocado, we've talked about citrus fruits, a lot of the berries, bananas are all high histamine, vegetables and legumes. So most legumes and beans, although sometimes pressure cooking can make them more tolerable. Most spices, a lot of spices are high histamine. Nuts and seeds, a lot of nuts and seeds are high histamine. A lot of people will say all nuts and seeds are high histamine. I know that, for some people, this is one of the only sources of like carbs and healthy fats, and something that is, sort of like a snack. I try to let people keep in, a couple of nuts and seeds, but we base that off of your food sensitivity test. And again, start with the foods that are the highest in histamine. So all of these should definitely be out of your diet. But there might be some other ones that you tolerate, and everybody's really different on that. So again, those food sensitivity tests can be helpful there. Cooking oils, and then we talked about leftovers, chocolate, boo, my favorite, yeast and yeast extracts. Okay, so then what are the other food groups that trigger mast cell activation? So I mentioned all of these in that initial slide, and I just wanted to give you more information on all of these little groups here so that you could go back and refer to this. So salicylates, also tied into phenol sensitivity. So salicylates or salicylic acid, foods containing salicylic acid fall into the phenol category, so phenolitic foods. A lot of foods contain salicylates, and a lot of people are triggered by salicylates. So it's a really common sensitivity I find with my mast cell people. As far as knowing if you are sensitive to salicylates, there's a couple of things that I watch for. So certain genetics mutations can make you more susceptible to issues with phenol sensitivity. So those are things like CBS, the BHMT, the SALT1, and the SU. Oops, that should not say MRT there. Sorry, that's a mistake. Take that MRT off. And the SU. Then I also use the MRT test and the organic acids test. So they actually both have markers for salicylates. So food sensitivity test has salicylic acid as a marker, and then the OAT has a salicylate marker on it as well. So those are great ways to know if you are sensitive to salicylates. You can also, sort of do it by looking at symptoms. So hyperreactivity, irritability, and rage are probably like some of the biggest telltale signs. So, a lot of us with Bartonella, right, also have irritability and rage, but specifically if you have irritability and rage tied to food, this is definitely a salicylate issue. So it's very, very tied to salicylates. Tinnitus, ringing in your ears, nausea, dark circles under your eyes, swelling of the eyelids, lips, and face, burning or sore eyes. Insomnia is a big one for phenol sensitivity. Ears, like ear pain or red ears is another really big sign. I used to get that all the time, where it's like, oh my gosh, it feels like my ear is on fire, and I look and it's just bright red and like painful to the touch. Like kind of a low grade chronic cough, especially coughing after eating. Asthma, respiratory issues. So salicylates trigger leukotrienes. Leukotrienes are one of the mediators that get released from histamine. From mast cells. I'm talking too quick. So leukotrienes are mediators that get released from mast cells. Leukotrienes specifically act in the lungs and in our respiratory tissues. So big tie to like asthma. If you're getting like lung pain or shortness of breath or breathing issues, definitely tied to salicylates. And then if you're someone who doesn't tolerate any herbs or spices, and I should have also listed fruits on here. If you're someone who like, I can't tolerate any fruits or any herbs and spices, that's a pretty good sign that you're phenol sensitive, because that's where most of them are. So here's all the high salicylate foods. So I listed those there. As you can see, some of them are common with high histamine foods like spinach, tomato, peppers, but some of them are not. So that's a good list for you there. So another food group that can trigger histamine are foods high in glutamate. A lot of us have mutation on our GAD gene, and GAD is something that helps to convert glutamate to GABA. So when you have a mutation on your GAD gene, your glutamate will not be converted to GABA, and it will trigger mast cells. So common symptoms again can be also hyperactivity, irritability, and rage. anxiety, panic attacks, tinnitus, POTS, heart palpitations, shortness of breath, difficulty thinking. Like if you eat something and then you're just like, oh gosh, like it's past brain fog. It's almost like that, like kind of confusion, sort of, disoriented kind of feeling. Insomnia is another big symptom of glutamate sensitivity. A lot of different foods have glutamate in them. Some of these we avoid naturally just in our, natural food diet that most of us are on, but definitely take a look at all of these things on here. And, when you get more time on your own, but a lot of, really, a lot of things that contain glutamate. So a lot of the meat, so any of the like protein powders, hydrolyzed protein, protein concentrates, protein isolates, bone broth, gelatin, all of those are kind of the biggest hitters from a glutamate standpoint. Beans, legumes, and peas, all high in histamine, high in glutamate. Bouillon, processed meats, L-glutamine, that's in a lot of like, gut and digestive supplements that will get converted to glutamate. Leftovers are really high in glutamate. A lot of different seafood items. MSG is probably the most well-known one, but a lot of different foods there. So this is my last food slide here. So oxalates are another really big trigger to histamine. So oxalates are something that some of us deal with. Some of the common symptoms to look for would be eye pain. A lot of autistic kids have oxalates, and some people will describe it as like, it feels like there's sort of like pokies in your eye. So eye pain, joint pain, fibro-like pain, so kind of, fibromyalgia type stuff. Genital pain, especially like vulvodynia. So if your vulva is very sensitive or inflamed, you have pain during sex. If you get actual just pain down there when nothing is happening, you women out there, that's a really, really big sign that you've got oxalate stuff happening. Low back or kidney pain, kidney stones, frequent urinary tract infections or interstitial cystitis. So that's a really big connection to oxalates and to mast cell activation. Cloudy urine, sandy urine, crystals in your urine, kidney stones, and burning feet. So those are some of the bigger, the bigger symptoms of oxalates. So kind of look for. And as far as sources, so certain foods have them. And then the other big source of oxalates are byproducts of yeast and fungal overgrowth. So any yeast and fungal overgrowth in the body actually puts out oxalates as sort of a waste or a byproduct. So if you have yeast or fungal overgrowth, which many of us have, most of us have, that also raises your oxalate levels as well. So that might make you more susceptible to being sensitive to high oxalate foods. So how do you know if oxalates are a problem outside of just the common symptoms? Definitely if you have kidney stones or interstitial cystitis or vulvodynia, those are probably some of like the they're so specific to oxalates that if you have any of those, you likely have an oxalate issue. Some of these other ones can be also tied, from other things. So sometimes symptoms don't tell us 100%. There's actually on the organic acids test, the Great Plains OAT organic acids test, they actually have an oxalate marker. There's a few different oxalate markers on there, and it gives you a really great breakdown of yeast and fungal metabolites. I think it's the very best way to identify if you have a yeast and fungal overgrowth, because it's just not very accurate on stool. Like almost all of us have yeast or fungal overgrowth because it's the most opportunistic organism in the body. So if there are other pathogens, which we all obviously have, there's almost always going to be yeast and fungal overgrowth. And it just doesn't come up on a stool test very well. So I really like using the OAT for that. Plus it has the oxalate markers on there. You can also have your doctor run a complete urine panel, but you want to make sure it includes the urine crystals. So make sure they include that piece. And if you test positive for crystals, those are definitely oxalates. This is sort of what those look like in urine. They have sharp, jagged edges. They also bind a lot of your nutrients, a lot of your nutrients. So high oxalate foods. So these are all the foods that are in high oxalates. I'll just leave this list with you guys. I won't read through all of it, but you can see there's, some fruits and vegetables, a lot of the nuts and seeds, and then of course, all of the beans and legumes. So those are ones that are really difficult from an oxalate standpoint. Okay. Okay, so those were all my dietary slides. So we're still on step 2. So we're talking about how can you lessen your overall triggers to mast cell activation and reduce your reactions. And the first step of that is removing triggers that are in our control. So we talked about the environments, we talked about diet. Now we're going to talk about personal stressors. So stress plays a huge role in triggering mast cell activation, and that's because mast cells sit right next to the nerve cells, and so they trigger each other. So when the nervous system is stressed, the mast cells get triggered. When mast cell degranulation happens, the nervous system can get triggered. So the big goal for all of us in healing, specifically today, we're talking about the goal as to get your mast cell activations down, but also just for general healing, you want your body to spend as much time as possible in that parasympathetic state. The parasympathetic state is that calming side of the nervous system. It's the side where all of the basic activities in the body actually happen. So all those innate sort of programmed activities like breathing and detox and digestion and motility in the gut and nutrient absorption, all these various things only happen in the parasympathetic state. So that's really what we want to do, is try to shift our body into that state as much as possible, which is really hard. It's a really tough thing to do because we are sick and we have a lot of pathogens that are triggering us and keeping us in that sympathetic state. So some of those things aren't in our control, but there are a lot of things that are in your control that contribute to you being in fight or flight. And that's what we're going to talk about, here today. So ways that you can increase parasympathetic or be in parasympathetic a bit more and decrease stress. So we already talked about reducing EMF and dirty electricity. That will just trigger you right into fight or flight and keep you there. So that's why it's really important to do that step. Just general life stressors, do you have a job that you hate that is super stressful and a boss that's just a real pain in the ass? Are you in a bad relationship that's, negative or abusive or, challenging? Well, I shouldn't say challenging, right? All relationships are challenging. Wrong word. Anyways, so work, relationships, all those life stressors, right? So all those can make a difference in keeping you in that triggered fight or flight state. So some things that you can do at home that you guys all know about, meditation, yoga, qigong has been one of my favorite things to use. They have a movements practice that you can do, but there's also sound healing. If you're physically not up for a movement practice, you can just lay there and passively listen to qigong sound healing, detox baths, grounding. There's other forms of sound healing. Binaural beats are really cool. You can download those on iTunes or Amazon or any places. But essentially binaural beats help the body to increase alpha and theta waves in the brain, which help to calm the nervous system. Diaphragmatic breathing, also a really good way to engage that parasympathetic and calm the nervous system. So you want to breathe in through your nose and send it down into your belly and push your belly out, and then breathe out through your mouth. And you want your exhale to be twice as long as your inhale. So if you inhale for 3 seconds, exhale for 6 seconds, and try to increase that time as much as you possibly can. That can really, really engage the parasympathetic. So I have people who can't do anything else. They're just laying in bed, and this is what we have them do, once an hour. I just want you to do 5 minutes of diaphragmatic breathing, or if that's too much, then it's like 3 times a day or 2 times a day. Let's try to do 5 to 10 minutes of diaphragmatic breathing, and you can kind of work your way up, but it's a totally free tool. It's a tool that you don't have to use a lot of strength or energy to do, and it works very well. There's a lot of brain retraining and limbic retraining programs out there that really can help, again, to shift that body out of that fight or flight pattern. We think about Lyme and mold. One of the reasons it's so difficult to overcome is because even after you've actually treated the exposure, you've detoxed, you've killed off pathogens, your nervous system and your immune system are very dysregulated. And even with all those stressors gone, they tend not to just come back into balance, on their own. Sometimes they could use some retraining. They need to relearn how to be in a calm state, essentially. That's kind of the easiest way to say it. So some of the things that are out there, and I'm not going to go into detail on all of these, I just give you guys a list and you can investigate on your own. Vagal nerve exercises, I use these at home. This is the book that you can get them from. You can order it on Amazon. Annie Hopper's DNRS program. The Gupta program is another limbic retraining similar to Annie Hopper. And some people just like that one over Annie Hopper's program. Everybody's different. So if you don't jive with Annie Hopper's program, take a look at the Gupta program and see what you think. It's different enough that depending on your personality and your lifestyle, you might prefer one over the other. EMDR is a really great form of brain retraining that I use, that I love. Somatic and shamanic healing to heal traumas are also really, really important in retraining the nervous system, is some trauma healing. Trauma can play a really, really big role in keeping us sick and keeping our nervous systems in a constant, fight or flight loop, essentially. And we need to work on that piece to get out of that fight or flight zone and to get into a more healing state. And all of us have trauma because we have chronic illness, right? And we've been through all of these terrible, terrible things. We're not believed by our friends and family, we're isolated, all these awful traumas that we go through just being chronically ill. So no matter if you think you have trauma or not, you likely have some type of trauma that's playing a role in your nervous system patterns. Other treatments out there, cranial sacral. I just love cranial sacral, PEMF, lens, FSM, frequency specific microcurrents, the biomat. Love my biomat. I've had it for like 7 years. It's my favorite tool. I still lay on it every night. Detox bath, float tanks, visceral and lymphatic drainage and visceral manipulation. This was so huge in helping me heal and engage my parasympathetic nervous system. Castor oil packing and ionic foot baths. Those are other things that you can do. I also did an entire webinar on the nervous system mast cell connection. So it's basically a 2-hour webinar where that's all I talk about. So it's some of these same things that I just went through, but in a lot more detail, and then other information. You can actually find that on my website, which I'll give you here at the end of our talk. But if you want to dive in more deeply on the nervous system piece, especially if your symptoms are very neurological, neuroinflammatory, then you definitely want to dive into that, because you'll get a bit more information than what I was able to provide in this more overview piece today. Okay, you guys, so that was all of step 2. How am I doing on time? I'm at 4:20, okay, or 3:20 your time. All right, I knew I would talk too much. Okay, so this is probably, the where we're going to spend a lot of time, the rest of our time, or most of our time here. So step 3 is immune modulation. So we have first essentially identified, what our triggers were. We pulled all those triggers out that were in our control: environment, diet, supplements, and medications, all the things that we just talked about. Now we're on to step 3, which is we need to calm and stabilize that immune response so that you're not reacting to absolutely everything. And oftentimes, just by moving out those triggers, people will get a reduction in their symptoms. But then we want to add on these extra sort of protective layers to keep those mast cells stabilized and keep your bucket lower, so that when you go back to detox or treat Lyme, you can be more effective and better tolerated. So I'm going to blow through all of these, but these are basically the 4 ways to reduce mast cell using supplements and medication. So there's block histamine receptors. So these are all of the over-the-counter and prescription H1 and H2 blockers. Stabilizing mast cells. So these are things like prescription cromolyn sodium, ketotifen, and Singulair. There's also natural mast cell stabilizers. So the big ones: quercetin, luteolin, pycnogenol, stinging nettle, milk thistle, butterbur, feverfew, vitamin C, Bicol skullcap, evening primrose, GABA, and L-theanine. So these are the ones that I use the most in my practice. Are there other herbs out there that stabilize mast cells? Yes, but these are the ones I find to be the most effective for my patient population. Degrading or breaking down histamine, is another way to reduce reactions and to reduce histamine intolerance. So you want to have some things on board that are going to break down histamine in the gut. So those are things like DAO and xylanase. So DAO is an enzyme that helps to break down histamine in the gut. That's a really important one. A lot of people really see a big difference when they go on the DAO. Some people notice nothing. So everybody's different, but it's an important one. Xylanase. So if you're someone who figures out that you are salicylate or phenol sensitive, xylanase is an enzyme that can help you break down phenols and salicylates and make you much more tolerable to those. We're going to talk about brands and all that here in just a minute. The other way that histamine gets degraded or broken down is through bacteria in the gut. So the certain bacteria in the gut break down histamine, and certain bacteria produce histamine. So you want to pick a probiotic that's histamine degrading species. So Megaspore is always my kind of first go-to. But then there are some really good lactobacillus and bifido bacteria that also are histamine degrading. So rhamnosus is one that is really great. Reuteri, Bifidobacter bifidum, and infantis and longum are all really good. I like using custom probiotics. They have a blend called D-lactate free that has some of these items in it, but they also do single strain probiotics, which I really like because a lot of people I work with are sensitive to probiotics. And if that is you, you do not want a probiotic that has multiple species in it. You want to go single species probiotic. And I always recommend starting with the rhamnosus. Binding histamine is the other way to reduce histamine. So zeolite is a great binder to histamine. There's another binder called Enterostel that you may not be familiar with. You can buy that on Amazon. So those are the 4 ways to reduce. Now I'm going to kind of go into detail on each of these. So when we talk about quercetin, it's the bioflavonoid. This is one of the things that I use the most, although I have a lot of people who are really sensitive to this. So if you're phenol or salicylate sensitive, some people who are phenol or salicylate sensitive will not tolerate quercetin because it is a phenol. I like to use pure encapsulations. I typically tell people to start with 250 milligrams once a day, slowly work up to 500 milligrams 3 times a day as sort of a max dose. Your tolerated dose or your appropriate dose or helpful dose might be in the middle of that. Luteolin, another really, really big go-to. Luteolin is probably the favorite one that I use. Definitely, it's extracted from artichokes, another bioflavonoid, natural mast cell stabilizer, and antihistamine. It also has some antiretroviral properties. The formulations that I use are Young Nutraceuticals Luteolin Complex and Young Nutraceuticals Mirica. So if you guys are familiar with the Mirica product, it has luteolin and one other active ingredient, PEA, that I'll talk about in a minute. They also make a product that's just luteolin. I really like both of these products. They're typically pretty well tolerated for most of my folks. Another great source of luteolin is perilla extract. So perilla is a seed, and the great extracts that come out of that are luteolin and rosmarinic acid. Rosmarinic acid is actually a natural antiviral. So this pure encapsulations perilla extract is one that will give you some antiviral properties, great for COVID. And in fact, there's some really good data with rosmarinic acid against COVID. So this is a good protective item for COVID, or even a treatment item for COVID if you're someone who's dealing with post-COVID syndrome. I think I heard somebody talking about that as I came in today. Perilla extract is a really great one because it's got that antiviral component to it, but then it also has luteolin in it, which makes it a mast cell stabilizer. Neuroprotect is the other kind of like big brand out there that has luteolin in it. Fisetin. So fisetin is a newer bioflavonoid on my radar. I've only been working with it for a few months, but I've really seen some pretty good results with people tolerating it and it helping. It's a mast cell stabilizer. Also has some anticoagulant properties. I know Dr. Nancy Brown talked to you guys about hypercoagulation and its role in chronic Lyme. This has some mild anticoagulant properties to it as well. So I like life extension biofisetin. Pycnogenol. So if you're someone who's really phenol sensitive, pycnogenol, and you're not tolerating quercetin, luteolin, or fisetin, any of the bioflavonoids, pycnogenol is kind of the one that you could go to next. So a lot of people who don't tolerate these will tolerate pycnogenol because it is actually processed through a totally different pathway in the liver. So you won't get that trigger for phenol sensitivity with this one. So I like pure encapsulations, pycnogenol. It comes in 50 or 100 milligram doses. I recommend starting at the 50. You can work up to 100 milligrams 3 times a day. All right, so vitamin C is a natural antihistamine. Most vitamin Cs are made from corn, ascorbic acid. Most ascorbic acid extracts are from corn. I have a lot of people who do not tolerate ascorbic acid. Most people I work with don't tolerate ascorbic acid. So the vitamin C sources that I use are this brand here, Ecological Formulations, vitamin C 1000. It'll either say non-corn or it'll say tapioca. And so it's tapioca sourced, but I think they just changed their packaging, and now it says non-corn source. So that's the one I typically use. You can also obviously get some vitamin C from foods, although a lot of the foods that contain vitamin C might be difficult to tolerate. A couple ones that I have some people tolerate are camu camu powder and Australia's kakadu plum. Both of those come in powders, which you can buy on Amazon, and they're both fruits that are very, very high in vitamin C. Kiwi is also really high in vitamin C. Okay. Licorice root and milk thistle, also really good to use. I'm going to whiz through so we can get to more information. And then these are some of the other natural antihistamine supplements I use. Stinging nettle is one that I use for a lot of people. Again, if you're someone who's sensitive to all of the bioflavonoids, the quercetin, the nettle, the luteolin, quercetin, luteolin, and fisetin, and the pycnogenol, stinging nettles might be something that you tolerate. It actually helps salicylate and phenol sensitivity because it is a leukotriene inhibitor, and leukotrienes are the mediator that gets triggered with high salicylates or high phenols. I really like using the Gaia brand. Evening Primrose, if you test for high prostaglandins in your workup, Evening Primrose is something that can take those down. Butterbur and Feverfew. So these two, especially if you have headaches or migraines, they can be really, really helpful. Headaches or migraines triggered by histamine. Both of these supplements can be really helpful, Butterbur and Feverfew. Okay, and then there's also some nervous system support that's not really antihistamine, but because it stabilizes the nervous system, it also stabilizes mast cells, because they sit together like we talked about, right? So skull cap, specifically Bicol skull cap. So this is the type of skull cap that has mast cell stabilizing properties. It reduces neurological inflammation and calms the nervous system. The brands I like, there's a powder on Amazon you can buy, Lift Mode Biaclin powder. BioPure has one. I personally use a alcohol-free tincture that is from Secrets of the Tribe. It's an organically sourced, alcohol-free based line of tinctures. I use it for a lot of my herbal supplements because it's a great quality source and they're all alcohol-free. Skull cap is a really great one. L-theanine or GABA. GABA is a calming neurotransmitter. L-theanine is a precursor to GABA, helps the body make GABA. This can really make a big difference for people with mast cell symptoms, particularly, of course, with anxiety, irritability, insomnia, heart palpitations, things like that. PEA is a special fatty acid that the body uses to protect and repair damaged tissues. It has neuroprotective and anti-inflammatory as well as mast cell stabilizing properties. It is included in that Miraca product that also has the luteolin, but you can also buy it by itself. The product I recommend is called Nootropics Depot on Amazon. And then other things that I use to calm the nervous system that, again, aren't really mast cell stabilizers, but I do use them frequently in my practice, so I thought I'd list them, are magnesium threonate. So this is the only form of magnesium that crosses the blood-brain barrier. Super important to get that in. Really can help to calm things down. Lithium orotate can also help to calm the nervous system down. And there's a really great supplement called Parasim Plus that I talk about in my nervous system webinar that I use in my practice and stock in my practice that a lot of people really like. It's basically a formulation that helps to push the body more into parasympathetic or encourage parasympathetic more. Okay, and then we look at over-the-counter and prescriptions. So we've got all the H1 blockers. You guys know what all these are that you can buy over the counter, and H2 blockers. Not as big of a fan as H2 blockers. A couple of the other over-the-counter tools that I use more commonly are a product called Nasal Chrome. It's a nasal spray that is a mast cell stabilizer. Works really well for like hay fever type symptoms. I also really recommend Zatador, which is H1 and mast cell stabilizer eye drop. So it's made from catatophin. There's no other ingredients in it, so it's typically pretty well tolerated. So if you're someone who has itchy eyes or red eyes or swollen eyes, any of that kind of stuff, that works very well. prescription antihistamine and mast cell stabilizer options. So these are the ones, again, that I use most of my practice. Now, of course, I can't prescribe things, but these are the ones that you'll want to talk to your doctor about using. So cromolyn sodium is one that is one of the big go-to ones. Some people don't tolerate cromolyn, and if you're someone who didn't tolerate cromolyn in the vials, you should really have it compounded at a very low dose. 25 milligrams is what I'd recommend. So extremely low, because the regular dose is 100 milligrams per vial. So these come in these little vials, and essentially you take 2 vials prior to each meal and at bedtime. That's the full dose. So 100 milligram vials. So when I have people who don't tolerate the vials, I have them do a compounded form at a super low dose of 25 milligram. And it's really interesting, but I have a ton of people who did not tolerate the vials that do really, really well on low dose compounded cromolyn. They actually notice a difference on even a tiny, tiny dose. So everybody's different. This is where working with a practitioner can really help you identify, well, what else can be done? If you're like, I tried cromolyn, it doesn't work. I tried this, it doesn't work. There are other things to consider there. So just kind of keep that in mind. Ketotifen is another prescription mast cell stabilizer and antihistamine in one. Singulair is a leukotriene inhibitor. So it works really well for phenol and salicylate sensitivity and asthmatic type symptoms. Hydroxyzine is an antihistamine that is also really good for anxiety, insomnia, can also be helpful for itching. Promethazine is another antihistamine that I've had several people really, really find super helpful for nausea, gut pain. I had a patient whose neck pain like completely went away when she started promethazine. That was interesting, and anxiety. So these are some of the ones. There's a ton of other antihistamines out there that can be prescribed to you, but these are the ones that I see most commonly helpful, and those are kind of like my go-to recommendations. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the digestive support. So I mentioned this as part of the 4 ways you want to break histamine down. So you can do that using the DAO enzyme. I use what's now called Histamine Digest. It used to be called Umbrelix DAO. So if you're using Umbrelix DAO, they just reformatted and they're rebranded, and they're now called Histamine Digest, but it's the same exact formulation, just rebranded. So DAO breaks down histamine in the gut. This is a really important piece to histamine intolerance. Houston Enzymes, the brand Houston Enzymes, which you can buy on Amazon, has a product called No Phenol. And it helps with salicylate and phenolitic sensitivity. So it helps the liver basically break those things down. So it can be very, very helpful to have some of these on board if you're sensitive to salicylates. Zeolite is a way to bind histamine in the gut, and Enteris gel also is a way to bind histamine in the gut. Enteris gel, super, super potent, so be really careful on this, but it's also really good for like radiation if you have to have some type of test where you're exposed to radiation. Enteris gel has some really good results around it. And then there are, again, species that produce histamine and species that lower histamine. So you want to pick a probiotic that helps to reduce histamine and isn't putting more histamine and loading up your bucket that way. Okay. Okay, and then, there's also, when we think about mast cells, we think about there's an imbalance between the Th1 and the Th2, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this because I want to have some time for questions, but things that can help to balance that Th1 and Th2 response, usually if you have mast cell activation, you're really like pegged more on this Th2 versus Th1, and that's why you're staying in this sort of hyperreactive state. So you want to have a balanced, even response between these 2 arms of the immune system. These are some of the things that can help or have been shown to modulate that Th1, Th2 balance. So colostrum, products like SBI Protect and Mega IgG 2000 are ways to get immunoglobulins in without having any dairy exposure. Omega-3 fatty acids. So this is a tough one with mast cell because most of these come from sardines and anchovies, which are high histamine. The ones that I find the best tolerated, Seeking Health has a product called Optimal Fish Oil. It comes from, I think it's from cod, or pollock, maybe it's some white fish essentially. Seeking Health Optimal Fish Oil. So that one I find is pretty well tolerated. And then the algae omegas tend to be well tolerated ish, although a lot of the allergy omegas, the fillers in them are not great. So that one is a bit tougher. I really like this Optimal Fish Oil item. Peptides. So the peptides are the new kids on the block. I know Nancy Brown, Dr. Brown talked to you guys about peptides in her talk. Whenever that was that she spoke to you a couple months ago, I think, and they can really be very, very helpful for balancing the Th1, Th2. So I've started to use these in my practice as well after sort of waiting to kind of see the longevity of peptides. They sort of came out big like a year and a half ago, and really just wanted to see what would happen and how people are tolerating them. I've had a lot of people who didn't do well on them, but I think it really matters where you're getting them from and which ones you're using. And you really want to work with a practitioner who knows what they're doing on these, because they are pretty potent. And powerful. There are some that are in supplemental form. A lot of practitioners are using prescription peptides, but there are some available in supplemental form. One of those is integrative peptides. So these are the ones that I use in my practice and Dr. Brown uses in her practice. Both she and I chose them because they are easier to access, and they're also usually typically lower dosages than some of the they're not quite as potent as some of the prescription ones. So the two that are working well that I have found so far for mast cell people are the TB4 frag, which is thymosin beta 4 fragment. So it's not the full thymosin beta 4 peptide, it's a fragment of that, but it essentially helps to bring balance to this Th1 Th2 response. The other one that I'm using in my practice is called KPV, which just kind of focuses in on stabilizing mast cells. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that, but those are other ways that you can balance out and calm and stabilize the immune system. I'm also not going to go into a lot of detail on this because I want to be able to get to your questions, but the cell danger response plays a really, really big role in triggering mast cell activation, mostly triggered by toxins, as well as infections. So I could do an entire webinar, just around the cell danger response, and we can do that at another time, but something to, just sort of research and look at. Neil Nathan's book Toxic talks a lot about this, goes into a lot of detail, but fairly understandably in a fairly understandably way on the cell danger response. So if you want to learn more about that, take a look at Neil Nathan's book Toxic. These are some of the things that I use to help calm that cell danger response. So pantethine or B5, biaclin, luteolin, and a homeopathic called Ceramin. Nutrients. So a lot of different nutrients can play a role in stabilizing the immune system and making DAO and supporting methylation. That plays a role in histamine intolerance. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this again, because I want to have some time to answer questions, but you can use this as a resource to come back and take a look at it. Putting in anti-inflammatory foods and antihistamine foods is also a really good, way to go. So adding foods in that can decrease histamine is a nice thing to think about. So apples, artichoke, fennel, onion, watercress, peaches, pomegranate, basil, cumin seed, black cumin seed, ginger, parsley, and peppermint are all really good natural antihistamine foods. The last part about calming and stabilizing the immune response comes from hormone support. And this is probably going to be my next webinar that I offer in my practice, and I can let you guys know when that's available. But again, we could do a whole webinar just based around how mast cell and hormones are tied together. But the biggest thing that I want you to take away from today is that hormones definitely trigger mast cells, and estrogen is the biggest problem. So you can be estrogen dominant, whether you're a man or a woman. Estrogen dominance basically means that you have high estrogen compared to your other hormones, progesterone or testosterone. And so for women, to know if you have sorry, I'm getting tired at the end of the day. My brain is slowing down. To know if you have issues with estrogen dominance, you want to look for those flares that happen during ovulation and menstruation. So I have a ton of women I work with who are like, Billy, like the whole 2 weeks from like ovulation to when I get my period is just hell. And I'm in a flare for like 2 weeks. And then I have 2 weeks that are so much better. So that's estrogen dominance. You're just getting constantly triggered into a mast cell flared state. So if you have migraines, headaches, increased mast cell reactions, insomnia, crazy emotional swings, all of those are signs that if you're having those during ovulation or menstruation, doesn't have to be both, could be one or the other, or that whole 2 weeks, that's definitely a sign that estrogen is playing a role in triggering you. Men, you're not out of the, out of the woods on this one. So you can also be in a state of estrogen dominance that could be triggering mast cell activation. Just because your overall estrogen levels are lower doesn't mean you can't be in estrogen dominance. What happens to a lot of us is that we get low testosterone, not only for men, but also for women. But if you're a man who has really low testosterone, one of the reasons you could have low testosterone is because some of your testosterone might be being converted into estrogen. And that is due to a special enzyme we like to call aromatase. Aromatase is an enzyme that gets upregulated, meaning it goes faster. It converts more testosterone into estrogen when you have mold. And so a lot of people deal with low testosterone for that reason. So man boobs, excuse my completely non-medical and potentially offensive term there. Those are the things that you want to watch for if you're a man. So if you have really low testosterone, or if you have man boobs, those are two really big signs that estrogen could be playing a role in your symptoms, even if you're a guy. The Dutch hormone panel is the one that is my go-to. I don't trust anything else because it gives me the most information to know exactly how to help you from a hormonal standpoint. Just testing serum via LabCorp to me is not enough to know what is going to be effective for you. You need to be able to see the metabolism of the hormones, how they're being broken down in the body. Super important. These are all the tools that I use to help balance estrogen. Again, not going to go into all of those today, but just to kind of mention them to you and give you an overview. All right, so that was a long step 3, immune modulation. How am I doing on my time? Terrible. Okay, so general tips. I'm just going to roll through these really quick. So you want to work with someone who knows what they're doing and someone who can help you navigate all of these various steps. You're likely going to need a multi-dimensional layered approach. So most people who have mast cell need to be on several different mast cell stabilizers and antihistamines in combination with each other. And the only way to figure out which ones are going to get you stable is unfortunately through trial and error. Now we can, like we've talked about today, use diagnostics to determine which ones might give you the most success, which ones you're more likely to tolerate. Working with a practitioner who uses these all the time can also be helpful in guiding you to have less trial and error time. But unfortunately, there is a trial and error process that has to happen here. So when you're trialing new supplements and medications, you want to start with one thing at a time. You want to titrate really, really slowly so that you can evaluate its tolerance and its effectiveness. Once you've titrated up to the recommended dose or whatever your tolerated dose is, then you can start the next thing. So one thing at a time. Yes, this is a painstakingly slow process, but you just want to do one thing at a time. Otherwise, you're going to have no idea how things are affecting you. You want to add things in at the lowest dosage possible, and you want to wait a minimum of a few days before trying to increase it to the next dose. Some people I work with who are the most sensitive, I'll only have them increase something every 1 or 2 weeks. So oftentimes we're just, going minuscule amounts, but that's what we do in order to keep you stable and not, have you have setbacks. You may not get all the way up to the therapeutic level. I know there's a lot of practitioners who say you're not taking enough of this to even make a difference, but I really, really find that is not the case. I see it with so many people in my practice that little teeny tiny doses of things can actually be very powerful for us sensitive people. Try not to try something when you have other things going on, because then you're going to have a hard time knowing, was it the supplements or was it what I had going on in my day? So for example, you don't want to increase a supplement and reintroduce a new food on the same day, or you don't want to go to some new detox or body treatments on the same day that you increase a supplement, because you're not going to know if you have post symptoms, if that was from the supplement increase or it was from the new treatment or the new food that you're taking. For those of you women who have that crazy flare for those 2 weeks in the second half of your cycle, try not to make a lot of, increases or introduce new things during that time, because again, it might be really difficult to tell what's actually triggering you. Is it the actual item, or is it just that you're flared during this time? Stress obviously can play a big role there too. So just kind of think about those things. You want to be very mindful and methodical and go slow and do one thing at a time, and just be patient. I know it's like a painstaking process, but this process and being slow in this process is what will get you to a more stable place. Okay, we're on to step 4, reducing the toxic burden. So I'm not going to talk a lot about this because we don't have time and I want to get to questions. But essentially, that's the next step. So once you've stabilized yourself, then you want to start detoxing. And you guys will get these slides after we meet today, so you'll be able to go back and look at some of my detox stuff. Again, there's a whole nother webinar that we could do on how to detox if you have mast cell activation, or how to treat pathogens if you have mast cell activation, because once you are stable, there are still things that you need to be careful of. Sometimes you can't go back to all of the aggressive treatments. You need to do things still very slowly, very methodically. Certain types of treatments are not going to be tolerated if you have mast cell activation. And those are things that, I don't have time to go into today, but are really important to think about. So you want to get to a stable place. Get all those reactions down so that you're not reacting to absolutely everything. Get your baseline symptoms down. You should get a lot of symptom relief doing just those first 3 steps. And then you want to focus on detox. Once you feel like your detox is really moving and you spent some good quality time there, then you want to go to treating pathogens, which is what you guys are already doing. So this is sort of my order of operations. I like to detox. I treat viruses and retroviruses for people who have that as part of their mast cell picture. Bartonella is probably the biggest Lyme or tick-borne trigger to mast cells, so that's big on my list. And parasites. So Bartonella and parasites are kind of first up after, mold and viruses. Once parasites have been cleared, then I work on the gut stuff. So SIBO and dysbiosis, yeast and fungal overgrowth, and then kind of go back to treating the other Lyme infections. So again, I shared with you guys, but for me, like I spent a whole year just on calming and stabilizing the immune system. And then I spent like another 1.5 years only on detox, nothing else, no actual antimicrobial treatments. Then I went into actually treating all of the pathogens. So I know it sounds, again, slow and painstaking, but this is a way to keep you from just getting worse and worse and worse, and allow you to treat and make real progress. Okay, so we're going to open up for questions, but before I do, just want to give you some information about working with me. I do obviously do one-on-one coaching. I also have some webinars available on my website, and I'm expanding those webinars to include some more topics. I can, I work with people, like I said, 90% of the people I work with have mast cell activation. So I really do a kind of personalized approach. Right now, I'm actually running a wait list for new patients. So if you're someone who's looking to work with someone, if you'd like to work with me, my wait list is about 4 months out right now. I'm working as fast as I can to get those folks in, but I am on a wait list right now. My rates are $225 to $300 for the initial consultation. That just depends on how long we go. And then all my follow-up rates are $150 an hour. You can email me here at this email if you would like to ask any questions or be added to my wait list. If you're interested in working with me, you can use this email right here to be added to the wait list. I also offer supplements. So if you are ordering supplements from online sources where you're getting full retail pricing, you can hit my website. I've got some discounted supplement links available. They give you about 20-30% off of retail pricing. You don't have to be a client of mine to get that discounted supplement ordering. And then I also stock certain products in-house. So there are some products that we talked about today that I stock in-house. And if you're interested in those, you can reach out to me again via this email. So I stock Miraca, Luteola, and Histamine Digest, Parasin Plus, and the integrative peptides. Okay, so I'm really trying to get some more webinars and more information out there soon, especially now that I'm running a wait list. I just want everyone to have access to information until I can work with you one-on-one. So kind of be on the lookout for some of these things, hopefully coming up this year or in the coming year or two. I've got some references here that you guys can look at later. And I think we're going to open up for questions. So now that I've taken up our whole 2 hours, of course, my long-windedness, Joanne and Jody, you guys want to feed me some questions?
Sure. So our first question is from Colleen, and this is there a link between excess histamine and insulin resistance? Can histamine irritate the blood vessels like glucose, causing plaquing? Excuse me.
Yeah, it's a good question. I do definitely see a link between histamine intolerance and blood sugar in general. I'm not going to use insulin resistance specifically because I can't speak to the data behind that. But there's definitely a link between blood sugar in general and mast cell activation. I have a lot of people that I work with who will get like sudden, blood sugar drops or sudden high blood sugar where they will be chronically high blood sugar all of the time, and then will develop insulin resistance. So I definitely see that those two things are connected. I don't know the exact mechanism for how they are, but just clinically observing them, I see it very frequently in my practice.
Okay. This next one is from Bass, and it says, is it the hormone dominance in men or low estrogen? Is it the hormone dominance in men or low estrogen?
Okay, not totally sure about what that question is, but I'll try to figure out how to answer that. So in men, you can be estrogen dominant even when you have low estrogen. So men are going to have low estrogen, but you can still be estrogen dominant, meaning that your estrogen is higher than your testosterone. So that happens when estrogen is elevated and testosterone is lower than estrogen comparatively. So it's all about the balance between the two hormones. So when we think about estrogen dominance, it can happen from multiple different ways. It can happen with just crazy high estrogen, but it can also happen with normal level estrogen, but really low progesterone or low testosterone, or it can happen when you're both right around the same marker. So maybe your estrogen, your progesterone, and your testosterone are all right around the same level. So we want the variance between them. We always want progesterone and testosterone to be comparatively higher than estrogen. And there's some ratios that you can watch out for when you're looking at blood work and things like that. But yeah, there's multiple different ways to be estrogen dominant. So you can have low estrogen and still be estrogen dominant. Hopefully that answered that question.
Okay, the next one is from Andrea, and it's, do you see consistent results between MRT and IgG sensitivity testing? Or do they often conflict in what they say a person is reacting to?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. So sometimes I see the same things and sometimes I see different things, but I don't look at it as a conflict. I look at it as more information because, kind of what you have to keep in mind is that you're looking at two totally different immune reactions. So with the MRT, you're looking at mediator inflammation. So you're looking at histamine, prostaglandins, cytokines, leukotrienes. That's what they're measuring on that. So if a food doesn't have a mediator inflammatory response, then it won't come up on the MRT. On the IgG, it's only looking for an IgG response. So some foods that don't have a mediator response directly do have an IgG response. And then the other thing we have to remember is that IgG responses will trigger the mast cell activation. So they're two totally different things. And that's why you want to do both, because both of them are valid sensitivities, right? So you want to take the combination of those two together and combine them. It gives us more information on all the various types of food reactions that you could be having. So hopefully that answered your question.
All right. This next one is also from Colleen, and I have some issues with some of my pronunciation of these bigger words, so bear with me, Billy. What do you recommend for treatment of this is the cryptosporidium? Sporidium, does that make sense? The cryptosporidium?
Cryptosporidium?
Yes, thank you. So what do you recommend for treatment of that? And then the second part of that is Alina has many inflammatory binders.
What was that one? I'm sorry.
Alinia.
Oh, Alinea. Yes. Okay. Yes. So cryptolepsis is, for those of you who don't know, is a protozoa that can be quite difficult to get rid of. It oftentimes practitioners will use the Alinea, which is a prescription protozoa medication. I do like to use that in my practice, although I always use a compounded formulation because it's got nasty, nasty, nasty fillers in it, to your point. So I really like to use compounded there in Colorado. Flatirons Compounding Pharmacy will compound Alinea. It's also much more affordable to get it that way, strangely enough, than it is to get it oftentimes through the insurance. But it will avoid all of those crappy fillers so that you can tolerate it. I also like doing compounding because it's a pretty potent prescription, and you can when you compound it, you can compound it at lower doses. So instead of doing a 500 milligram, you could do a 250 milligram. So I do use Alinea, but I also use some natural antiparasitic treatment. I find that with Cryptosporidium or Giardia, you often need something like an Alinea or another prescription antiparasitic. But from a natural standpoint, I like to use that I find that are well tolerated. I like to use neem. I like to use garlic. I like to use artemisinin. When working with cryptolepsis or Giardia, it's important to focus on the liver because they like to migrate up into the liver. So I like to use things that help to clear out those bile ducts in the liver, like ox bile or TUDCA. And I like to use suppositories by BioPure called Nexus suppositories. It's a garlic artemisinin suppository, and it's just absorbed in a different way. Oral is really getting in mostly to the small intestine. You're not getting a lot of, colon activity there, but parasites can be in the colon and they can be in the lymphatic system in the liver. And suppositories will actually absorb into the colon, into the lymphatic, and up into the liver. So it can really help that aspect of things. So hopefully that answered your question.
This one is from Bass and is, what is your opinion of the carnivore or the elemental diet for killing parasites?
Yeah, good question. So it really, really depends on how you tolerate meat, for sure, because meat is very high histamine. So a carnivore diet means you're basically just going to be eating meat. And if you're sensitive to meat or you're having poor quality meats, that's not something I would recommend. I am not a huge fan of the carnivore diet overall. I feel like you're just really missing a lot of, nutrients and ingredients that you need. But it can be okay for short term in order to starve off, parasites and yeast and SIBO and things like that. So I think it's fine to do for a short term, as long as you're not sensitive to meats and you're getting good, high quality meats. Was there a second part to that question that I'm forgetting?
The elemental diet for killing
The elemental
parasites.
diet.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the elemental diet is typically used for SIBO and getting rid of SIBO. And I don't like the elemental diet because all the elemental diet formulations contain a bunch of histaminic ingredients. I don't find that people who have mast cell activation tolerate the elemental diet formulations very well.
Okay. This one's from Elise. She says, I live in an apartment complex with a lot of neighboring Wi-Fis, even though I've hardwired my own. What do you suggest, and what experience do you have with the success of Wi-Fi blocking paint?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, and it can be a really tricky thing because you can only control your own space. So, when all the other stuff is pointed at you, it can be difficult. So as much protection as you can get. So the EMF protective paint is something that that I like. It's called EMF Protect is the brand that you want to use. You do want to work with someone who knows what they're doing because it does require a grounding process when you use that paint, but I have a lot of people who use it and find it really effective. The other really big thing is the canopy, and I think you have a canopy, at least if I recall correctly, but if you're being bombarded by neighbors, you need a safe space. And so the canopy is essential in those types of environments because then it gives you a space that you can go into and be protected. And then some of the other things I talked about, there's those conscious copper products, little pieces of copper that help to neutralize EMFs and dirty electricity that you can put around your house and on your phone. There's the neutralizers that you can put into your plugs. So a lot of different things that can do something to help your environment, even when the stuff that's in your neighbor's neighbor space is pointed right at you.
So just to underscore then, Billy, what you were just saying, because Elise, the second part of this question was, is the bed canopy enough? So I think you've
Is the
answered
bed
that.
canopy
So I
enough?
just want to
Yeah.
make sure. Yep.
Okay, yeah. So I think the bed canopy is like the number one thing. To me, it's the thing that's going to be the most protective. Of course, it's one of the most expensive, but it's such a huge important tool. But you can't spend it 24/7 in your tent, right, in your canopy. So it's nice to have some of those other tools so that when you're out of the canopy, you're also getting at least some more protection.
This one's from Monica. Do you recommend people that are sensitive to meat getting tested for the alpha gal?
Yeah, I mean, I think that can definitely be something that can tell you if you're sensitive to meat. I don't think that's directly tied to the histamine factor of meat sensitivity, but certainly if you test positive there, you would want to avoid meats. But yeah, think about the sourcing as well. That can play a really big difference. If you haven't tried that US wellness meats, for my most sensitive people, that seems to be the one that works the best.
This one's also from Elise. She's asking, what do you say about getting more info regarding CNS neuro? What did you say about getting more info regarding CNS/neuro?
Oh, I know what you're talking about. So I did a whole webinar on how the nervous system and mast cell activation is tied together. And so that will give you a ton more information about the nervous system piece and the central nervous system and how it's tied to the mast cell activation. So you saw some of that information today, but I go into 2 hours essentially on just that topic. So if you go to my website here, there's a button at the top of the site that allows you to click on my webinars. And a couple of them are free and some of them are for sale for $20. So you can go on there and take a peek at that.
Okay. This one's from Lynn. Can you take the block histamine receptors if you have high blood pressure?
As far as I know, yes. I don't think that there's a contraindication to using DAO if you have high blood pressure, to my knowledge.
This one is from Janine. What do you think about Permine? I don't know if I'm saying that right, for a mast cell. Yep, for the mast cell stabilizer. I haven't found a stabilizer that I can tolerate yet.
Yeah, can be really tough. I have a lot of people in your boat, who've tried all of them and are really struggling. So, the formulation matters. So pyramine is by Metagenics. It is essentially perilla extract, which I mentioned as a source of luteolin. So the formulation that I use is called Pure Encapsulations Perilla Extract. I find that it is a little bit cleaner than the pyramine formulation. I can't remember what pyramine has in it, but there might be 1 or 2 ingredients that are kind of questionable. So if you don't tolerate the pyramine, then you should try the perilla extract from Pure Encapsulations, because it's essentially the same exact active ingredient, which is perilla extract, which is high in luteolin and then also high in rosmarinic acid, which is an antiviral. So I know Dr. Brown likes to use Paramine. I have some people who haven't tolerated that have tolerated the perilla extract, and vice versa. So again, it's the same active ingredient, but just different formulations. So if you don't tolerate the pyramine, I do find that a lot of people tolerate it, then try the perilla extract from Pure Encapsulations.
Can you give, oh, this is from Andrea, I apologize. Can you give advice for weaning off antihistamines?
Weaning off antihistamines. Yeah. So, there is a lot of, we didn't talk about this today, but there is some data around rebound reactions when it comes to antihistamines. And, some people really talk a lot about feeling that when they take an antihistamine, particularly like a H1 blocker, H2 blocker, usually H1 blockers, that they get relief, but then once it wears off, their symptoms are even worse. So there's a sort of rebound effect. Now, a lot of people don't feel like they get that. I'm someone who has never experienced that, but I have worked with people who do experience that. And in that case, it is important to get off, wean off of those. My recommendation would be to get on as much of the natural mast cell stabilizers and antihistamines as you can. Stabilize all those triggers that we talked about that are in your, control that could be triggering mast cell activation, so that those are calmed down. Then once all of those steps are done, you can start weaning yourself off of the H1 blockers and antihistamines. And you want to go, you want to go slowly and just do one at a time. And you want to go down sort of like incrementally. So that would be something that a practitioner would want to, work with you on. But I would say, taking the time to do the natural mast cell stabilizing antihistamine first will allow you to come off of some of the Benadryl and Claritin and Zyrtec and things like that.
Okay. This one is from Jeannie. If you're highly sensitive and trying to find a stabilizer and are also low in most of the B vitamins, do you find it hard to add Bs in without reacting?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I have a lot of people, like I was the same way when I was at my most reactive. I was not tolerating any basic supplements like vitamin D, any of my B supplements, like the basics. So I work with a lot of people who are like that. And yes, you need some B vitamins, but for a while we sort of have to be okay with you getting some B vitamins from food and just work on stabilizing. So you want to really take that time to get in those mast cell stabilizers and antihistamines and all the various tools we walk through today, because once you are to a more stable place, you will tolerate things like B vitamins and other things that, you're not tolerating now. But B vitamin sensitivity is no joke. And most of the people I work with have it. And even when you do add them in, usually what I recommend is that you don't do a B complex. So you don't want one that just has like a ton of different Bs or high dose Bs in it. You want to really target it, so just do B12, or just do, methylfolate, or just do B5, or just do B6. So just do one at a time. And also another good way to treat B vitamin tolerant or intolerance is to not take them every day. So instead of taking B12 every day, take it once or twice a week only and split those days up like Monday and Thursday, and take a small dose. So that's how I start people on things is we go very slow. We go small dose and we do one thing at a time.
This one is from Karen. My mast symptoms didn't show up until after I started treating Lyme and parasites. Could I add in immune stabilizing steps to what I'm doing, or should I pause the antimicrobials for now?
Yeah, it's a good question. So everybody's a bit different in this category, but a lot of people who show up to work with me are in such a terrible flare. They're not tolerating anything. And they've already kind of gone off of their antimicrobials and some of their detox things because they know that it's triggering. But if you're not sure if it's triggering, now because that developed after you treated, some of those things definitely might be triggering you. So for most people, I recommend coming off of the antimicrobials for a period of time and adding in the mast cell stabilizers and antihistamines, getting the immune system to calm down, and then going back to treatment. Because what you'll find is that you'll tolerate all of those things better. You'll be able to work up to higher doses of those things and have a more effective treatment.
Okay. This one is from Alyssa. I have come across some compelling information regarding substances like thiamine and methylene blue correcting a deficit in cellular respiration, which can be responsible for almost any pathology, including mast cell disorder. Do you have any experience with or opinion in thiamine or methylene blue to address mast cell issues?
Really good question. I don't have any experience with using those specifically to address mast cell activation. I know methylene blue is coming out big these days for Bartonella. But the respiratory piece that you mentioned, cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is all about, right, oxygen and getting oxygen delivered to cells. And oxygen specifically is a really, really big piece to the mast cell puzzle. So oxygen deficient environments will be an environment in which mast cell degranulation can happen more frequently. So low oxygen will trigger mast cell degranulation. So finding ways to bring more oxygen and cellular respiration can actually definitely improve mast cell activation. So, I use things like, diaphragmatic breathing and oxygen treatments and I like a product called hydroxygen and these various things, but certainly, again, I'm not familiar with exactly how to use thiamine or methylene blue specifically, but that line of thinking from a cellular respiration standpoint makes sense to me.
This one is from Zoe. I am on a very restricted diet. Would the MRT and IgG test be accurate if I don't have the majority of the food substances in my system?
Yeah, it's a good question. So IgG is definitely one that often isn't as accurate if you haven't eaten those foods for a long time. Now, it might help you identify foods that you are eating that you're reacting to that you didn't think you were reacting to. So from that aspect, it can be helpful. But yeah, just because gluten doesn't come up on an IgG test doesn't mean you're not tolerating gluten. If you've had it out of your diet for a long time, you might not get quite as strong of an IgG response. Mediator response is not quite as tied to that like IgG is. So mediator, the MRT can usually come up with a more accurate picture of foods, even if you're not, haven't been eating them for a long time.
Okay. And then Billy, can you put in the chat the permamine alternative?
Pyramine?
Yeah, pyramine, geez.
Yes.
Pyramine. I'm gonna get that now. Can you put that in chat? Mary is asking for that so
Yeah.
that she has that information. Thank you.
Definitely.
And then Andrea has one more question. Sorry, everything just slipped because somebody else, oh, that was you just putting that in there.
Me.
Sorry. So it just shifted my chat. Sorry, my eyes shifted there. So this is from Andrea. Do you use digestive enzymes besides the DAO and the phenol ones? If so, can you recommend brands?
Yeah.
I've had a hard time finding one as so many derived from mold.
Yeah. I hear, there's a lot of digestive enzymes that don't work well for people. So outside of DAO to degrade histamine and the no phenol enzymes, Houston Enzymes that makes no phenol also makes a product called Trienza, and it has xylanase, and then it has a couple other enzymes in it that are not derived from corn or molds. So that's a really good one that I use sometimes. The other one that's my go-to that I find is the best tolerated for most of my people, and I have a lot of people who say I don't tolerate any of them, and then we try them on this and they do well, is Pure Encapsulations. It's called Digestive Enzymes Ultra, and it comes in one with HCl and one without HCl. So two different formulations. If you're sensitive to HCl, you want to get the one without, but it's called Pure Encapsulations Digestive Enzymes Ultra. That's the one that is my go-to.
Great. All right. I think you've done it. I think you've answered all the questions.
Wow. All right. Excellent. Well, I'm so glad that I could be here for y'all and give you the information. I'll send you the slides, and that'll give you some more stuff, but feel free to reach out to me with questions that you have that come up, you guys. I'm happy to help in any way that I can.
Well, Billy, thank you so much for this wonderful, I mean, I know I can speak probably for myself and everyone. This is extremely helpful as we all struggle. So many of us struggle with this. So everybody, I am going to be, Joanne and I will push this out on Meetup, the recording, as well as the slides, as well as Facebooks. So you can go back and review it, listen to the recording, as well as review the slides. Billy, thank you so much. Always
Thanks,
a pleasure to see you.
I miss you guys. I miss connecting with everybody.
We miss you too. And then everybody, our next meeting will be February 21st. I did put it out on the Meetup group, and it will be an open forum. And then we'll be looking to have a speaker in the month of March. Have a great rest of your day, everybody. Be well, be safe. And thank you.
Bye, everybody.